Series 6's The Rebel Flesh and the Almost People is one of the most hated and forgettable stories in Doctor Who. But it's also an incredibly important story for the overarching Series 6 storyline, so I attempted to cut both parts into a single episode. Okay, so in The Rebel Flesh and the Almost People, the Doctor, Amy and Rory land on an acid factory in the near future after a solar storm, where the factory uses flesh to create clones of themselves which they control from a safe location to prevent injury or death in the dangerous work environment. After a second solar storm hits, the flesh clones are given a life of their own separate to their original bodies, and this episode focuses on the ethics and morality surrounding the clones and whether or not they should be treated as humans or decommissioned. Although this story is quite forgettable and hated on, it is also quite important to the overarching story of Series 6, as we find out the TARDIS didn't land here on accident, and the Doctor wanted to learn about the flesh as he believes Amy has been a clone for a while. Now, before I get into the changes I made in my fan edit, I first want to talk about what I don't like about this story. A big part of this story that people don't like is the character Jenny, as for some reason they decided to give Jenny's flesh version some monster-like abilities where she's able to stretch her body parts, and at the end of the episode she becomes this CGI monster that the characters need to run away from. As well as this, people don't like how close she gets to Rory, and especially how close Rory gets to her. Obviously Rory does care about her and is trying to protect her, which is a good thing, but for some reason he basically starts to fall in love with her almost immediately, which is a problem because Rory is shown to be incredibly faithful to Amy, which is shown when he guarded the Pandorica for hundreds of years, and it's shown that he cares about Amy more than the adventures with the Doctor, so this just feels incredibly out of character for Rory. Now, there's also the scene where we first meet the clone Doctor, which is full of him just regurgitating Doctor Who references.
Would you like a jelly, baby?
I don't know what the general consensus on this moment is, but I'm going to dive into this more when I get to the changes I've made. And the final thing I want to talk about, what I didn't like in this episode, is that as I was watching it recently, to me it felt like it should have just been one episode instead of a two-parter. So I decided to set myself the challenge of recutting this into one episode. Now, I was able to hide the cuts quite well in this edit because throughout the episode there's a storm happening in the background and you can often hear thunder and lightning, so I used that to my advantage and used the sound of thunder and the visuals of lightning to hide cuts in this episode.
Well, it would be safer to look for Rory and Jennifer with the TARDIS.
Now, as I said earlier, I also don't like the monster scenes that they have in this story. I feel like the dilemma between what they should do with the clones works fine on its own and the monsters weren't really needed. So I cut the scene between Rory and Jenny in the bathroom, and instead, after Rory chases after Jenny to try and find her, he first finds her in the room where she tells him a childhood story instead of the bathroom. I also had to edit the monster version of Jenny out of the tunnel scenes near the end of the episode because I think that acid flood in the factory is enough of a threat, and as I said, I wanted to edit out any of the monster scenes because I just don't think they were needed, and obviously the CGI is not great in these moments either. Now, this was definitely the most difficult scene to edit because I basically had to create my own sound design for this scene, which I think I did a decent job of, but you could definitely tell it wasn't the original audio, so I also added I Am the Doctor over that scene, as it is a bit of an action scene anyway, so it kind of works there and covers up the sound design that I made. Now, I also reduced some of the moments between Rory and Jenny because, as I said, I don't like how Rory basically falls in love with her because it just feels incredibly out of character. So a lot of their scenes are either cut completely or I've cut some bits out of it, and I also did this to help with the pacing of the episode as well. But after making all these edits that I've just talked about, the cut I made was still over an hour long, which meant I needed to cut more because I really wanted to get this to be the length of one episode. So instead of the scene immediately after the titles with Doctor, Amy and Rory playing darts and listening to Muse, I instead cut straight into the action with the TARDIS crashing. And although I don't mind the scene with them hanging out, I do think this works a lot better, especially when just making it one episode, it really helped with the pacing. I also decided to cut down the first scene we have with the clone Doctor so that it's not full of a load of references to past Doctors. I don't necessarily hate the original version of this scene, but I needed to cut out some more moments from this episode, and cutting out the string of Doctor Who references that are referenced in this scene just felt like the right way to go. Now, the clone Doctor is still present throughout the episode because it obviously becomes quite important near the end of the episode, but I just cut down this initial reveal with him in it a little bit so that there's not all those references in there. As well as this, to help with pacing, I also cut out the detail of Cleves having a blood clot and any of the mentions in that throughout the episode. Not necessarily because I don't like that or think it's a good element, but once again, I needed to cut some things out to make this standard episode length, and I just personally didn't think it was that important to the story, and it didn't really change if I got rid of it or not, so I chose to get rid of that as well. And as well as this, I also cut out some moments from other scenes just to help with pacing, such as cutting down the scenes where they're in the communications room, and all of these additional edits managed to get the final cut down to around 48 minutes, which is as close close to a standard episode as I could have got this. Now, I know some of you are going to be curious as to where you can see this edit, but I know from experience that the BBC can be quite strict with their copyright, which I know is going to make this really difficult for me to be able to post this somewhere. But if I do manage to make this publicly available somehow, I will have a link in the description and in a pinned comment if I get around to doing that eventually, but I don't know how likely it's going to be with how strict the BBC are with copyright. I've previously talked about how I would rewrite the hated Series 9 finale, Hellbent, in this video here.